High summer temps mean blasting your AC almost constantly to combat the heat. But unfortunately, this can also mean higher rates of AC system failure, which then leads to these vehicles being brought to your shop to get your AC fixed. While more customers isn't necessarily a bad thing, it does mean your shop must be prepared to work on a variety of vehicles, all with potentially different AC system needs. In today's video, we're going to talk about shifts in refrigerant, trends in AC service tools and equipment, and what you need to know before purchasing new AC service machines. Here to discuss all this with me is Brian Messenger, head of product management / workshop engineering and technical support at MAHLE. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Brian, can you tell me a bit about the trends that you've seen in AC service tools and equipment?
So if we were to step back into time, I always like to start with kind of the history of just refrigerant services on automobiles and even in heavy-duty applications. A common practice prior to any sort of regulations in the U.S. was if a customer experienced any sort of poor performance out of their AC system, the common practice was vehicle would come in, verify the concern, and a lot of times recommendations to replace various components looked more so like the refrigerant is compromised and let's evacuate the refrigerant, which the common practice, unfortunately, was venting that refrigerant into the atmosphere, replacing the components, and then pulling a very weak vacuum on that system and then recharging that system with the appropriate refrigerant. And it's important to remember that refrigerant capacities prior to any sort of regulations could exceed 3 to 4 pounds in a vehicle, which was very common. So as we progress into regulations, not only on the AC side, but also regulations from what are called CAFE standards, which is corporate average fuel economy standards, mandating that manufacturers increase their MPG across their portfolio. We also saw the shrinking of AC systems, so the required amount of refrigerant in these vehicles significantly decreased. And so having machines that not only captured the refrigerant as opposed to it being evacuated into the atmosphere, but had the ability to capture, recycle, and recharge with vehicles utilizing smaller capacity systems also required a more accurate way of charging that vehicle. And so we've just seen a unique evolution into air conditioning equipment that required, specific calibrations and calculations and automation to help the technician to take some of that guesswork out of the charging phase of that vehicle. And proper charge is what keeps the AC system working properly for a prolonged amount. Because if you undercharge or overcharge a system, you could see that vehicle back into the shop for premature compressor failure or component failure, a lot of times doing a disservice to the customer. So having equipment that can charge accurately has become more of a standard today than it was even 20 years ago.
Yeah, but having the tools and equipment that help the technicians along with what they need to do, it's just a major benefit. Can you tell me a little bit about how the increase in EVs might affect AC service? Do you believe that there might be another shift in refrigerant?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And there's some things coming to light, especially in the European arena, that is maybe nudging the US and in North America just in general into a different direction. But, I think everybody would agree that the EV segment of the automotive industry, there's always going to be a place. And, we may see it swing up and down as far as what percentage is captured. But everybody would agree that there's always going to be a space for EVs, especially in North America. So with that, we've seen changes to the AC system and its cooling abilities, because a lot of EV companies utilize the AC system to also help cool the batteries in operation. And so something that's very unique with that respect, utilizing the vehicle's AC systems to keep that battery cool, which is something that is almost mandatory, right? Because the battery life is probably the most important thing about that vehicle, and is probably also some of the hesitation that people have in purchasing an EV, is because it's kind of a guesswork on how long that battery is going to live. And so these automotive companies have really put forth some engineering to ensure that the battery life and the range is at its maximum level, to make sure to give that reassurance to the customer. But with that, we've also seen, because of EVs not having a belt-driven AC compressor, they're utilizing an electric compressor, and there's variations of that. And the good benefit for MAHLE is we actually manufacture not only belt-driven AC compressors, but also electric AC compressors. So we kind of have our feet in both worlds, on the front side at the manufacturing level, but also on the service side with our equipment that services these vehicles. So with that, we've seen R12 to 134A back in the early 90s, and then we've seen R134A over to 1234YF, which actually in North America began in 2012 with the Cadillac ATS. And so, now we're 10 years into 1234YF as being used in vehicles from the factory. A lot of lessons learned, but on the cusp or the forefront, North America switched to 1234YF because in 2007, the EU mandated a switch from 134A to an alternative refrigerant. And we kind of saw two directions in that path, one being CO2 or R744, and the other being 1234YF. And so, with that split, obviously comes new challenges in servicing. But right now in the European arena, there's talks of replacing 1234YF with yet another refrigerant. And one of those, 744, yes. But it looks like R290 might be the direction that manufacturers are going, which is actually a propane-based refrigerant. So something completely new in the market. And again, this is kind of progressing now in that arena. And, what we see in North America, it could be a decade from now before we see anything in that R290. But, I'm confident that the big manufacturers are investigating R290 as a replacement refrigerant for YF.
So what would the benefits of 290 be over the 1234YF?
Yep. So everything is driven by regulations. And so for the European Union, their big to do right now is PFAS, or forever chemicals. I'm not going to even attempt how PFAS breaks down, the actual scientific name behind it, but they're known as forever chemicals. And so in the EU, they're looking at banning PFAS. And if that comes to fruition, 1234YF will fall into that PFAS category. And so with that ban, now we're looking at alternatives that meet that PFAS ban, and R290 right now is really the only candidate outside of CO2 that meets those qualifications. So, what that looks like in the service industry, there's a lot to speculate, but until it actually starts coming into development, and again, because MAHLE produces AC compressors and heat exchangers and everything in that space, we're on the forefront of that, and so we're having constant conversations with our divisions that design those systems for the OEs to make sure that we're ready for when those are launched, both in at the global level, but here specifically in North America, that we're ready for those new refrigerants and whatever that service may look like.
So
regardless of what may or may not be happening in the future with refrigerants, obviously AC, it's always going to be a part of vehicle service and repair. So what should shops be keeping in mind when they're going to purchase AC service machines?
Yeah, I would say that probably the biggest pain point that I see in today, especially with the technicians, we're seeing a shift, maybe back towards the tradesmen, that the younger generation are pursuing tradesman type jobs, where there's been kind of a huge gap over the past couple of decades, and so people are exploring, the automotive technician as a career path. One of the things that's kind of unique in that is there's a lack of understanding or avenues for people to obtain that technical training that's required to be an automotive technician, because vehicles are very complicated. AC systems nowadays are so much more complicated than they were even 10 years ago, to be honest with you. And so one of the unique benefits of my position is I've also got the technical support team that report up to me. And so there's a lot of conversations around, things that we get phone calls into our technical support. A lot of times there are technicians calling in, struggling to utilize equipment because of their lack of understanding of the AC system, the dynamics between the machine at a static state and at a dynamic state, and then also the vehicle side of it. And, there's just no understanding between the two systems and what it is that they're actually doing. And so, a lot of times what happens is shop owners will purchase equipment, hand it to the technician and say, here's the tool, here's what I need done, I need you to figure it out. And so the disconnect between, a technician's understanding between vehicle and machine and what it is that they're actually accomplishing has been just a huge gap. If you rewind 30 years ago, the way that AC services were performed, it was all with analog gauges. And so you had to have a real understanding of, the high side and the low side, what the vehicle was doing, when to charge, when to close valves. Machines do all that now. Our machines, it's an automatic process. You essentially just tell the machine what you want and hit start, and then you can walk away. And if there is an issue, the machine lets you know that there is an issue. But, nowadays, with how complex the vehicle is, a lot of the phone calls that we have coming into tech support is just technician not understanding what's actually happening. And, so my recommendation for any shop owner looking to purchase equipment is to ensure that their technicians are properly trained to do so. And probably the best avenue for that is going to be the EPA 609, offered through Max or other channels. But training is hands down, I would say, is the most important for shop owners and technicians.
Training for sure is incredibly important when it comes to the tools and equipment that are being put in the hands of these technicians. I know you mentioned that MAHLE's machines do kind of a lot of that work for them, but without that understanding in the background, it does become just potential for a whole bunch of issues to rear their head.
Can you tell me a bit about your latest AC machine and just some of the features and benefits?
So, one of the things that I really like about our equipment, and let me preface this saying, I started my career as a technician, somebody using the equipment. I still, to this day, repair vehicles. So after I work here, I work in a shop doing primarily AC jobs. And I do that more for a benefit of my understanding of, what technicians are seeing so that we can help address those ahead of time. And it also helps us with innovation. Right now, I see a huge push, especially on the OE side of the business. So the business, when we're dealing with the manufacturers dealing with their dealership networks, right, that provide the in-warranty repair for vehicles, is a collection of data. Data is probably one of the most beneficial pieces in today's service. And so what's unique about our machine is we're collecting data in the background that we can custom tailor for shops, if they're larger entities, that own franchises or whatever that looks like, we're collecting data in the background that can be very valuable to those businesses and help them ensure not only is the vehicle being fixed appropriately the first time, but it's also a way for them to manage their inventory with regards to refrigerant. It's especially as expensive as refrigerant is today. They know how much they're collecting. They know how much is charging. So it's a way for them to keep track of that. But just to give you an example, the recommendation after doing a recovery, fixing a vehicle, if you're changing a component out, the vacuum time prior to doing the injection of the refrigerant is crucial. Doing an appropriate amount of vacuum on a system, that's what removes moisture from a system. And anytime you have excessive moisture in a vehicle system, that moisture mixed with refrigerant creates an acid, and that acid eats the system from the inside out. And that's what will cause premature component failure. And so ensuring that vacuums are sufficient is crucial. Our machine monitors that in the background. And so, I can not only see from start to end, but I can also see how long a vacuum was performed on a vehicle. And I can also see the level of vacuum that was achieved, which is, very crucial to ensuring that you're removing moisture out of a system. And so, providing that data to owners of the equipment, to larger companies. Right now, we see a huge ask, people looking for that data and ways to track that.
So I know we talked a little bit about being future AC ready, but apart from that potential switch and refrigerant, what are you seeing in the future with AC service?
So AC service, not only do we have just your traditional system, which is compressor, condenser, evaporator, and some sort of dryer accumulator, and then it could be thermal expansion valve or orifice tube. But we're also seeing the integration of ADAS systems, with the potential of refrigerant changing to CO2 or R290. Some of that's going to look like including carbon dioxide sensors inside of the cabin, so that if they see any sort of carbon dioxide coming in, that they can dump the charge immediately, right, to protect the passengers of that cabin, because the last thing you want is somebody passing out while they're driving down the Autobahn. But the same thing with R290. We're going to look at forward collision systems and lane departure systems that are integrated into AC systems, because if the vehicle suspects that it's going to get into a collision, it has the potential to dump the charge before the collision even happens. So to eliminate the flammability or combustibility of that system. We are seeing a huge leap from our traditional systems into that next generation that's going to include, much more safety components. And then you couple that with, again, that CAFE standard, that average fuel economy is, these manufacturers are looking at ways to decrease system size, to decrease the amount of parasitic draw on the vehicle overall, to increase that fuel economy. And so they're looking at smaller systems that are cycling on and off at different rates, and cooling fans that are engaged on a duty cycle as opposed to, on off battery monitoring systems. I mean, there's just a litany of different sensors that are integrated, or that the AC system is looking at when it's making its decisions. And so having an understanding of how all of those systems work. I've even seen vehicles come in, customer states AC is not performing properly, be due to a check engine light that has nothing to do with the AC system, but it's a way for the vehicle to save itself, right? To make sure that it's not emitting poor emissions out of the tailpipe. So it disables the AC system as a preventative measure. And so again, technicians having that understanding of not only the AC systems, but the complexity of all the other systems in a vehicle, I think is going to be the future, right? That everybody needs to look forward to.
Yeah. Definitely see some updates being made to training for the technicians as well, with those potential changes coming into play. Well, thank you so much for joining me, though. I had a great conversation.
Yep. Thank you for the opportunity.